Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Work with Purpose, a podcast about the Australian Public Service. My name's David Pembroke, and thank you for joining me. Today, my guest is Elizabeth Kelly, a lawyer turned bureaucrat who, during her legal career, worked on tasks as diverse as prosecuting serious fraud cases in Fiji to fighting corruption in the New South Wales building industry. She currently serves as the Deputy Secretary at the Department of Industry, Innovation and Science, where she is responsible for innovation, digital strategy and industry support programs. And I'm certainly going to talk to her about that in the context of COVID-19. But during a long and distinguished career of public service, Elizabeth has served as a Director of Policy in both the ACT and Northern Territory governments and as a Deputy Secretary in the Attorney General's Department and in the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, where she was responsible for machinery of government, cabinet, legal policy and governance issues across the public service, as well as the coordination of support to the Prime Minister. She joins me from her home in Canberra on Zoom. Elizabeth, welcome to Work with Purpose.
Thank you, David. Nice to be here.
How are you adjusting to working from home?
Look, I think I'm adjusting okay. It is very quiet, but it does allow you that time to reflect. That sometimes in a busy day with back-to-back meetings from 8 till 6, you don't always get the time to stand back and reflect. So I think I'm appreciating that part of it. I am missing the human interaction though, and so I have to do things like I try to make phone calls rather than email for at least a significant part of the day, so that I can maintain that human interaction, because I think it's too early to fall into the trap of just shooting off, spraying emails all around and thinking that that's effective.
So just in terms of that interruption sort of culture, because I've noticed it in the same at my workplace as well, that there are far fewer distractions. Are there parts of how you are perhaps thinking about how you will continue to work now that this has been forced upon you, and you'll try to cut down that distraction and level of interruption?
Look, I think it would be nice to be able to retain a bit of that discipline of standing back. And so I have been thinking about in future, I think I actually might try to work from home at least one day a week to just try to preserve that in some way, because I do think there's something of value there.
For sure. So in terms of that, and that's interesting to note that in fact that, at a very senior level, you are considering that. But do you think these changes will continue across the wider APS workforce?
I think that we will all, I think that what we will return to is the next normal. And I think that we will all change the way that we work. I think we've all been incredibly surprised at how effectively we can work remotely. And I'm absolutely happy to admit that I didn't think that it would work as well as it has. And I think that's been a lesson, that we don't need to have as much face-to-face contact and as many face-to-face meetings as we perhaps might have thought that we did.
What were those concerns that you had?
I've always been concerned about the technology, and our technology. We've been incredibly fortunate that we made some big investments in IT in our department last year that set us up really well for remote working. So we're all invested in flexible work. We've all got laptops. We've made some big investments in our IT infrastructure. So the technology actually has worked. And sometimes we work on a lot of business systems, because I'm also responsible for service delivery for support to business. And so some of those business systems, I was always worried about whether or not they would be able to function effectively remotely, but they've stood up relatively well. And again, you tend to think that you rely on human interaction, and you do, but perhaps not as much as we thought that we did.
Okay, so listen, to the response to COVID-19, there are a number of task forces being set up across different departments, and I believe that you have a leadership role in the COVID-19 task force inside your department. If that is in fact the case, what role are you playing, and what is the task force doing?
So my role, I'm doing quite a different job to what I was doing a month ago. So my role is to lead, in fact, 4 task forces that relate to supporting the Department of Health to make sure that we have enough personal protective equipment and medical devices to support us through the immediate response to the COVID-19 pandemic. So what happened at the beginning of the pandemic, probably more than 6 weeks ago now, the Department of Health the Department of Health is just doing the most extraordinary job. And so we looked as government about what are the areas where we could support them. And one of the areas that we could support them in was to help them in maintaining the National Medical Stockpile and ensuring that it had everything in it that we needed in order to meet the pandemic. So the Department of Industry took on that role of maintaining the National Medical Stockpile. So the Department of Health told us what they needed, and then we created, and I've got four division heads leading four different areas of personal protective equipment, and we went out and scoured the world to source additional equipment where it was required, and also looked at domestic manufacturer and whether there was domestic manufacture in some of those areas. So the things that we worked on was initially face masks, and we sourced a vast number of face masks internationally. And we also supported a small domestic manufacturer to significantly upscale. It received a reasonable amount of press. It was a company in Shepparton.
I saw that story.
Yeah, so we supported them to acquire some additional equipment. And when I say supported, we helped them to source it, we helped them to freight it, we dealt with all of the diplomatic issues in relation to getting access to freight in some of those more difficult environments. And we even provided the Army support to engineering support to get the new machines up and operating. So we've also supported another company that the South Australian government located and was working with, and have made significant orders from that South Australian company as well. So we've done that in the area of face masks. We've also sourced gowns, gloves, goggles. We've done a lot of work on ventilators, and first of all, sourcing supply, and then actually developing with our local company, developing a company that's going to produce ventilators according to a specification that we've developed with clinicians. And that company called Grey Innovation is actually going to be producing ventilators very soon for our needs. And then we also worked on test kits for COVID-19, and particularly locating quantities of swabs that are used for the testing process, and also working with a couple of Australian firms to develop a local testing capacity within Australia. So real investigators, we've got a network of business advisors and a regional network, and they're experts in particular industry sectors. So we just really set them to the task of identifying who were the local manufacturers and the local importers. And we also worked with all of the growth centres, particularly the Advanced Manufacturing Growth Centre. And really, it was almost like a detective novel, finding the right companies to work with, tracking them down, and then standing alongside them to make sure they got the inputs to help them to get TGA approval, and help them to get production underway.
That's a remarkable sort of, well, not only logistical but planning, as you say, investigative research into who can potentially help. What were some of the challenges? Because that sounds pretty good. It sounds it moved very well and it was quite efficient and effective, and that you were able to move different parts of the system, like your business advisors and your growth centres, to apply them to be doing different tasks than the normal day-to-day tasks that they would be doing.
Yeah, and I think that's what you always find with the public service in a crisis, is that everyone drops what they're doing, and they use their expertise and experience and they apply it in a completely new context. And so, utilising our business advisors who are working with companies every day. And so our biotech business advisors know the landscape very well. We've also got a growth centre in that area as well who knows the landscape. So combining that knowledge was really powerful. And then, the task forces they're populated by lots of policy wonks who kind of know about industry policy, but didn't necessarily know that much about ultrasonic welders and how to get them operating in order to fuse surgical-grade face masks. So let alone RNA extraction that's necessary for COVID-19 testing. So a whole lot of people learned a whole lot of new knowledge incredibly quickly, enough that we could identify and work with and support companies to meet those needs of the stockpile.
So you've really then been right at the centre, at the heart of that logistical support to the Department of Health. Have you got any stories, specific stories perhaps, or moments of inspiration where you've looked back and you've thought, wow, the APS, when it does put its mind to it and it does react, it can be flexible, it can be agile, and it can move very, very fast?
Oh, absolutely. And honestly, every day was like that. And I think using the Army in a manufacturing company in rural Victoria was pretty creative. And that was really an idea. We did find... we brought on some support, a person who had some expertise and background in the Army and who was working with us in those early days. And we found this company and we were just thinking of how we could scale it up quickly because it's a great Australian company, but we needed to scale it up quickly. And so because of this person's particular background, they said, oh, I know some people in the Army who'd be able to fill that gap. And so we explored that. We've not done that before in the Department of Industry, but that's just an example of how in a situation where there's a really urgent need, you just think of every option, and so that was a really creative solution. The Army have now moved out, and that company has now taken on additional local staff, and is running on its own. But it was a fantastic solution to get them going really quickly.
Now, I know, the response has been very successful, and obviously the APS deserves great credit for the way that it's played its role in the success of the response. But at this early stage, can you see changes in the way that you've been operating in your business that you will then take on in terms of some of these relationships that you've been able to establish through this crisis?
Look, I think it's been a great example of how all of the different APS agencies can work together, and how we can have really respectful and productive relationships and really complement one another. So I think the Department of Health were really surprised at what we were able to produce in a relatively short period of time, because they have been managing the stockpile, on their own for a very long time. So I think it actually did unearth that there are relevant bodies of expertise all around the APS, and to get the best result overall, we need to actually draw on those and find creative ways to draw on them. So, I think it really has been a powerful demonstration of how when we work together, we're certainly greater than the sum of our constituent parts.
And certainly that ability to move quickly, I think that's the constant theme that's coming to me, is that, the velocity of the decision-making inside the APS has been, something to behold. That, there is the crisis, it has to be responded to, but the organisation, which is a very, vast organisation, has been able to respond quickly. Do you think that speed will be retained in the future?
Well, look, I hope so, but process is really important. And so it is really important. It allows us to meet our accountabilities. So I never want to suggest that following the right process isn't important. In a crisis, we do get some allowances from that. And so there were certainly some allowances in relation to procurement that were formally made in relation to meeting the pandemic challenges. But, sometimes in ordinary course of business, other processes are appropriate, and so it's the right thing to follow those. But when we need to, we certainly can move incredibly quickly, and we will always have that capacity.
Now, in your day job that you had prior to the pandemic, you had responsibility for those critically important areas of the economy, innovation, digital strategy, industry support programs. Have you had time yet to start to think about going back to your day job and how you're going to play a role in restoring the health of the economy? Because that's obviously going to be, as soon as the health crisis is past, it's going to be the economic crisis, and you're going to be right in the middle of that as well.
Yeah, so as a department, we tried to get a little ahead of that. And so whilst I'm working on the immediate response, and so my time frame is until 31 July, so what we need until 31 July. But there is another area of department under one of my colleagues, Mike Lawson, who's been looking at recovery, and they've been looking at recovery for some weeks now, so that they can start to anticipate those issues. As the immediate needs work winds down, then I'll move back into that recovery work. And there are certainly a lot of opportunities for Australia in the recovery of the global economy, and we're keen to help Australia maximise those areas where it does have advantage.
And where might those specifically be? Where do you think those opportunities lie, and how quickly are business people going to have to respond to take those opportunities?
Look, one of the areas is agriculture. Certainly, we perhaps don't realise it so much in Australia, but globally and particularly in Asia, food security is a really significant issue, and particularly in the context of the pandemic. A lot of countries in the world are looking very much to how they can assure their future food supplies. Australia is not only a great and efficient agricultural producer, but it's also a world leader in agricultural technology for efficient agriculture, for efficient use of fertiliser, efficient use of water, aquaculture, hydroponics, a whole range of areas, the use of blockchain for table to plate integrity of food chains. They're all areas where Australia has enormous advantage globally in our technology, and there are a lot of countries in the world that are really interested in that technology, particularly at the moment. So same applies for mining. We've been able to, our mining technology is absolutely world leading, and our mining sector has been able to continue to operate throughout the pandemic. So that's something that's of interest globally. Clean energy, biotechnology, 3D printing of medical devices, desalination technology, they're all areas where Australia has technological advantage, and we should be looking at pursuing those opportunities as the global economy recovers.
Do you have any particular insight as to how the market is going to change? Are countries going to be turning in more and thinking about their national economy more so than the global opportunities, or do you think that will pass very quickly and the global trade system will get up and moving quite quickly?
Look, I think that there's not going to be one response. Some countries will obviously do that. Other countries, if you look at a country like Singapore, who recognises that they can't domestically manufacture everything that they need, they certainly can't supply all of the food that they need for their population. So what they've looked at for some time, and now they'll do more of in future, is diversifying their supply chains so that they aren't reliant on any one country for particular components of a supply chain. So there are those directions as well. We'll probably do a bit of both in Australia, and certainly try to make sure that we're maximising those opportunities of where we're placed in the region in Asia, which will be a great engine of growth in the recovery. And we want to make sure that we make the most of those opportunities.
Fantastic. Well, listen, we are taking questions from IPA's Future Leader Committee, and I do have one here from Steph McLennan at Geoscience Australia for you, Elizabeth, and it says, we've seen a very fast ramp up of task forces and work in the government's response to COVID-19. As a senior leader, how are you transitioning from that responsive crisis phase to a more sustained effort? And what is your thought process for transitioning your teams to that sustained effort?
We've thought about this actually a great deal, because the early weeks were quite frenetic. And so that was something that that was necessary, and everyone was thrilled and happy to do it, but it wasn't a sustainable way of working. So after the first few weeks of what really was quite extraordinary levels of activity, we then made sure that we were adequately resourced, and we also restructured the department to make sure that we had moved resources and leadership to where the work was, and we actually made conscious decisions not to actively pursue whole areas of work within the department because our focus was COVID-19. So we review that very regularly. So we will begin over the next few weeks to transition resources out of that immediate response area into that longer-term recovery area, and we will move SES and leadership and other resources into the recovery areas. And we'll keep that continually under review because this is not a sprint, and I think the Prime Minister says that repeatedly. This is not a sprint. So we need to find ways to work sustainably. And part of that is understanding that resources have to move to where the priority is, and we have to get a bit ahead of that so that we don't have people, falling over from working really ridiculously long hours and under great pressure as they were at the very beginning.
Just in terms of that focus, do you think that this crisis has sort of, in some ways, provided the lens or created a lens which has enabled you to and your colleagues to look at some of the work and think maybe, actually, why are we doing that? Maybe we shouldn't have been doing that in the first place. Has there been any of that sort of reflection take place?
Look, I think that there's not an area of work that we've come across that we said we don't need to do it anymore, but there are areas of work where we've said, right now, we can't do that. And so we've got to make really, clear decisions about priorities, and right now we can't do that, or that can wait. We can put that aside for 6 months and come back to it at that time. So, I think that's a really important discipline to bring. It would have been really foolish for us to try to keep everything going when we'd taken on these significant new responsibilities, and when really the country needed us to be focusing on COVID-19 and the response and recovery from it.
Okay, the next question, similar type of question from the IPA's Future Leader Committee, and this is from Rebecca Lee McDougall at the Department of Education, Skills and Employment, and she asks, a lot of work at the moment is aimed at preventing the spread of COVID-19, but I'm wondering what work is being done to prepare us for life after COVID-19? And perhaps you have already answered that question in a way, Elizabeth, but if there's some sort of insights about that future planning, and I know in your department you mentioned Mike Lawson, but perhaps you might be able to reflect on other areas of the APS where that future view is taking place.
Yeah, no, well, I certainly think our focus will be the recovery of the economy and our contribution to the recovery of the economy. But in relation to the APS, it'll be a question of, I think it will be a question of how we work in future. Our use of technology, our use of remote working is going to be something that could actually significantly change the way that we work going forward. So I don't think, we certainly don't think at our department that things will go back to the way that they were. So it won't be a new normal, it'll be the next normal, as they say. And that will mean that we do things differently.
And how are you, by the way? I should ask, because that's a fairly big job that you've had. You're holding up okay?
Oh, look, no, I'm fine. Thank you. Actually, the work was really done by others. And so there's lots of people who've made a huge contribution. And, really our colleagues at the Department of Health have borne really a huge weight, and they have worked extraordinarily hard to make sure that Australia is so well placed. So it's been absolutely fantastic to be able to provide even some small support to them.
And how do you feel then, as someone who's been involved in this and looking around the world at other countries, how do you feel that the APS has played its role to deliver the response?
Look, I'm incredibly proud of what we've achieved. I say that cautiously, touching wood, because I also think that this is a much more complicated a thing and it's certainly not in a position to declare victory. But I'm really proud of what we've done so far. Really proud of the response right across government, every agency that's been involved. I think that we've worked well together. We've delivered a really good result for the Australian community. We've got to keep going. There's still plenty more to do, and it's certainly not over. But I'm incredibly proud of what we've done so far, and I do really feel like we have made a difference.
Do you feel like there's that sense of control at the moment, though, that, the major part of that crisis, that front end is gone, and really the organisation of the APS is being quite robust and been able to respond, and as we go into the next phase, that it's still got plenty in the tank to be able to manage the difficulties ahead?
Look, I think it's really important not to in any sense think that we've got this thing under control. And so I've just today been participating in a roundtable on scenario planning, and one of the scenarios that governments around the world are thinking about is a scenario where we are in a very knee-jerk attempt to come out of the pandemic, then cases surge again, then we clamp down again, then we come out again. That's possibly the worst case scenario for the economy, and it will mean that our recovery will be delayed even more than if we were to stay with control measures in place for a longer period of time. So I think that it's not at all certain what our future is ahead of us and the future of many countries around the world. So not in a position to declare victory, but we're certainly thinking really carefully, and we're in a better place than so many other countries.
And certainly you must feel, that your career choice, rather than pursuing that career in law, that jumping across into government was a good choice at this time, because it sounds like you've been inspired by the work that you've had the opportunity to do.
Absolutely, yeah. No, I never looked back. So I've always been really happy to be part of government and part of serving the community.
So there you go, Elizabeth Kelly, the Deputy Secretary at the Department of Industry, Innovation and Science, and the person who is in charge of Australia's medical stockpile. 4 task forces to deliver that. Interesting. Who knew? Again, though, isn't it great to see the agility, people stepping into new roles, being curious and delivering? I love that story of how, the business advisors connected to the growth centres, connected to the department, was able to sort through those supply chain issues, and then to bring in the Defence Force there to deliver at the back end of the project with the industry partner. So, a great example of teamwork. Next time, when we get Elizabeth on the program, I do want to ask her about prosecuting serious fraud cases in Fiji. I'm sure that she's got a million stories about that. And indeed, what is life like when you're a bureaucrat for the Northern Territory government? But we'll catch up with that next time. So one of the things that's really interesting about this COVID-19 response is this large movement of people across the APS from department to department. So, next week on Work with Purpose, we speak with Catherine Campbell. Services Australia, as you will remember, were absolutely swamped with calls, massive numbers, like 400, 500% increase in daily business. Thousands of staff from across the APS being sent into call centres, huge amounts of technology being applied to really solve that problem. And certainly they did seem to be able to get on top of it. So it's a great story, and I'm certainly looking forward to talking to Catherine Campbell about that next week on Work with Purpose. But for the moment, thank you so much to Elizabeth Kelly for her time. Thanks to you, the audience, for coming back once again, and we will be back at the same time with Work with Purpose next week. Bye for now.
Work with Purpose is a production of Content Group in partnership with the Institute of Public Administration Australia and with the support of the Australian Public Service Commission.